Another visit that could have been part of an election campaign if MPs had let him start one. Boris Johnson today had to answer a question no Prime Minister wants to hear. He had to respond to yesterday's judgment by Scotland's highest civil court, suggesting he may have misled the Queen by saying he wanted to suspend Parliament for a new Queen's speech, not simply to shut down rows on Brexit.
Did you lie to the Queen when you advised her to prorogue, to suspend Parliament?
Absolutely not. And indeed, as I say, the High Court in England plainly agrees with us.
Actually, it didn't say it agreed. It said it didn't think it should judge such matters. But the attention now turns to the Supreme Court, which on Tuesday will start the process of making the final judgment. Some in the government appearing to hint that judges might be biased against Brexit. The Prime Minister distanced himself from that view.
I'm not going to quarrel or criticise the judges. Clearly, there are two different legal views. The High Court in England had a very different opinion.
Seems like a piece of cake to me.
One of those Boris Johnson threw out of the Conservative Party last week just got a letter from the Chief Whip suggesting there might be a way back in. He's not sure. It sounds like a party right now he'd like to rejoin.
Well, I wouldn't be comfortable if we were a populist, if you like, Trump-style party. I hope that that is not the direction the Conservative Party goes in, and I hope that that will become clear in the days and weeks ahead.
Not clear right now to you?
I think it could become clearer.
Downing Street sources report that Parliament's decision to compel the Prime Minister to seek a Brexit delay if he hasn't got a deal next month seems to have changed the focus of work in the building. There's much more attention, they report, on trying to get a deal. Signs too that the DUP MPs who blocked Theresa May's deal might be showing more flexibility. Some people had the chances of a deal really quite low, 10, 15%. Do you feel they've gone up just recently?
I do, yes. And when you look at the noises coming out of Dublin, for example, I think there's a clear indication of greater flexibility.
Some people feel a bit of movement on your side as well. The DUP have looked over the precipice and panicked a bit.
Oh, we're certainly not panicking, Gary. We're focused on what we need to do.
But there's movement on your part, isn't there?
Well, we want to get a deal, that's for sure.
There are still quite a few Tory MPs who look like they'd struggle to support the kind of deal Boris Johnson seems to be pursuing. But what's changed is that there could now be some Labour MPs who could make up the difference. MPs who are worried that the opportunity for Brexit could be slipping from their hands altogether.
Well, I think talking to colleagues, we're looking at anything from 20 to possibly as many as 50 Labour MPs who would be very interested in looking at any deal that the government was able to bring back to the Commons for examination.
Jeremy Corbyn won't be voting for this deal if it happens, if Boris Johnson brings it back. But do you think he'll be secretly, fingers crossed behind his back, hoping that you and quite a few others do see it through the House of Commons?
Well, I don't think it's a secret where Jeremy's position on the EU has been for 40 years. He clearly respects the outcome of the referendum. He clearly wants to do a deal on Brexit with the European Union.
In Brussels, the EU's Brexit negotiators seem to be hosing down expectations of a deal being sealed.
Regarding the talks, we are still ready to examine objectively any concrete and legally operational proposal from the UK.
Michel Barnier told MEPs that Brussels was worried Britain might be planning to diverge drastically from EU rules to undercut European Union economies. He said he didn't have any reason to be optimistic of a deal right now.
Gary Gibbon there. Well, divisions at the top of a political party over Brexit aren't confined to the Conservatives, of course. Our political correspondent Paul McNamara is in Westminster. Paul.
Yes, well, Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell has been out and about today trying to talk about possibly trying to shorten the working week. Although with Labour MPs I've been talking to, that's not what they wanted to chat about. Inevitably, it all comes back to Brexit and that deep fracture that runs through the Labour Party. Now, just in case you're not familiar with Labour's position on Brexit, Jeremy Corbyn's come out and said that if there is a general election soon, Labour win it, they will go back to Brussels, renegotiate a new Labour Brexit deal and then put that to the people in a second referendum on the ballot, Labour's new Brexit deal or Remain. But what they haven't said is which the party will campaign for, Remain or their own Brexit deal. And yesterday, Tom Watson came out and said, this is basically said this is absurd. We need to be unambiguously the party of Remain. Now that caused a lot of criticism for Tom Watson yesterday, but by last night, Emily Thornberry was almost trying to dampen it down a little bit. She's just saying, it's Tom just being Tom. He doesn't speak for the Labour Party. He doesn't speak for the whole of the party. Actually, MPs I've been talking to today say Tom does speak for us. One of them said to me, try selling our position on the doorstep. People think we haven't got a clear line, and they're right. But what's really interesting is that today what we started to see is what a possible post-election blame game could look like if there's an election soon and Labour don't do well. Another MP said to me, if we lose, it will be because we didn't just come out and back Remain, and that is the leader's fault. So if things look fractured at the moment, this could all pale into insignificance as to how deep the fractures might be in a few months' time.
Paul, thanks very much.
Well, a little earlier, I spoke to the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell. I began by quoting the Labour MP Stephen Kinnock, who said that Labour has had more negotiating positions on Brexit than the Kama Sutra.
Yeah.
It's funny, but it's also serious,
I know.
And it's true.
Well, Stephen's got the same eloquence as his dad, actually. Not really. I think we're straightforward now. We've had to look at how we adjust our policy over time because of the different circumstances, but the policy is straightforward.
Straightforward. I'm sorry for interrupting, but yesterday, Tom Watson, the deputy leader of the party, said a referendum first, then a general election, then Jeremy Corbyn, the boss, said actually no.
Yeah, well, Tom was making a contribution to the debate, but that's
not a helpful one as far as you're concerned.
That's Tom. You know what he's like. He will throw things into the debate like that because that's what he feels. But the party policy is straightforward.
What is it?
We want another referendum. Let the people decide.
When?
Let me come on to the different points. The second point is they need to decide between a realistic leave option and Remain. And then out of that referendum, a Labour government will implement what the people have decided. When? We want it as soon as possible, but we want a general election first. We want to rule out a no-deal Brexit. We're not in any way worried about a general election.
You were offered one, you turned it down.
But we want to get rid of no-deal Brexit first of all. The terms in which we were offered one by Boris Johnson was on the basis that we had to trust him with the date of that election. And to be honest, someone who's even been accused of lying to the Queen, his own brother doesn't trust him. How could we trust him?
But the longer you wait, the more the impression that the other side is trying to cement that you are the party of dither.
Yeah, I can understand that, but I think
and confusion.
I think
that sticks.
No, I don't think so. I think the Tories are insulting the intelligence of the British people. But the British people out there can cut through all that bluster.
Given Yellowhammer, given the prorogation of Parliament, given the shambles of this administration, you should be storming ahead in the opinion polls.
I think you'll see when that general election comes, just as in the last general election, we will, we'll ensure that we demonstrate that those polls that we've seen, like we did last time, where we're 24 points behind, are actually not the reality of how people feel. And when they go into that booth to cast their vote, I think you'll see a Labour government emerge.
On the doorstep, your biggest weakness is called Jeremy Corbyn.
I disagree completely.
Your biggest weakness is called Jeremy Corbyn.
Look at the
why don't you replace him as leader?
No, I think you've got this completely wrong. I think we'll prove that in the general election. What we're offering is someone who is wise, honest and trustworthy. The Jeremy Corbyn's slogan when he's elected leader was honest politics, straight talk, and that's what he's about. Contrast that with, as you said yourself, a Prime Minister where the headline today is questioning whether he lied to the Queen.
But the adjectives that are commonly associated on the doorstep with Jeremy Corbyn, not everywhere, but in many parts of the country, that you need to win are weak, confused and dithering. That's not exactly a winning formula.
No, I think on the doorstep what we'll be able to demonstrate is someone who's caring, compassionate, consensus building, bringing the country together. What we need at the moment is not huff and bluster that we're seeing from Boris Johnson. We need a leader who recognises that the country is divided, but a leader who can bring us back together, and that's what Jeremy Corbyn can do.
Isn't the big issue here that you still haven't made up your mind in the Labour Party whether you're more afraid of losing Remain voters in places like Islington or Leave voters in places like Doncaster? No. You need them both, and you simply can't have them both.
Well, I think we can, in the sense of we can bring people together by allowing them to have their say and that's what we'll do.
But you're losing them to both sides. You're going to lose people to the Brexit Party, you're going to lose people to the Lib Dems.
Well, it's interesting. That isn't reflected, I don't believe, in the polling that's been done, or in the discussions we're having on the doorstep, or in the mass meetings we're having around the country, where people are pouring out to listen to Jeremy Corbyn and many of our other spokesmen.
Well, with me here in the studio now is the pro-Brexit Conservative MP, Andrew Bridgen. Andrew Bridgen, it's a nice line for Labour on the doorstep, isn't it, that the Prime Minister lied to the Queen. I just wondered, are you embarrassed about the fact that a Conservative Prime Minister has had to publicly deny lying to the Queen?
Well, they're the questions that the media have asked him. At the end of the day, prorogation is a completely normal parliamentary procedure. It's happened hundreds of times. And indeed, we just finished the longest session of Parliament without a suspension for almost 400 years.
But the question wasn't about prorogation itself, it was about the motive, wasn't it? And the Court of Session judges in the highest court in Scotland unanimously agreed that Mr Johnson was motivated by the improper purpose of stymieing Parliament. And I assume that's not what he told the Queen.
I'm sure that John Major did exactly the same, prevent disclosure of embarrassing revelations about Conservative MPs all those years ago. At the end of the day, the Liberal elite in our country have never lost a serious political battle, and they don't like losing the referendum, and they're marshalling all their forces, whether that's the judiciary, the mainstream media, or arcane parliamentary procedures to fight against the democratic decision of the people. So, I'm determined with others to make sure that doesn't happen.
We're not talking here about a Liberal elite, we're talking about judges in the highest court in the land in Scotland. They also argued this court will accordingly make an order declaring the advice to the Queen and prorogation was unlawful and is thus null and of no effect. So are you saying you dispute what the judges in Scotland are saying?
What I'm saying is that there needs to be a difference between the legislature, which I'm a member of, and the judiciary. That needs that separation. I'm not going to comment directly on issues which are sub judice. Let's see what the Supreme Court decide next week. But what I will say is I do wish that the SNP would stick to the principles I'm sticking to and keep out of the judiciary. So
just to clarify, when the Business Minister Kwasi Kwarteng said many people, not him, many people believe judges are biased, was he talking about you?
No, I don't think he was. But, I mean, there was the big hoo-ha over the Supreme Court ruling with the Gina Miller case earlier on. Ironically, without that case and us having a meaningful vote, we'd be stuck with Theresa May's withdrawal agreement that isn't leaving now.
But I'm just asking, do you accept what the Court of Session said, or do you believe, as Kwasi Kwarteng said many people do, that the judges are biased in this instance?
I think there will be a suspicion that political pressure may have been placed on them, and it's interesting, it's the Scottish higher court that's done this, turned over a decision by a lower court. But, I mean, these cases have been brought in Northern Ireland and elsewhere, and they haven't come to the same conclusion, have they?
So you're worried at all about the Supreme Court judgment next week?
I will be looking upon it with interest. I hope they'll come to the right decision. Prorogation is nothing unusual. It's completely normal. We've just completed the longest session in 400 years of Parliament.
There are whispers of a deal. If there is a deal which the DUP decide to back, would you back it?
I'm not going to comment on the specifics of a deal I haven't seen. I'm having a meeting with Boris Johnson and with other MPs at Chequers tomorrow evening, and I'll be fascinated to know the progress he's making. I'd like a deal. I'd like a Super Canada free trade agreement, and I'd like mutual acceptance of standards rather than taking EU regulations.
But what's your position on the backstop? Because that remains the sticking point.
The backstop's unacceptable. Theresa May's original withdrawal agreement is unacceptable. And there's far more wrong with the withdrawal agreement than just the backstop, as far as I'm concerned.
David Gauke, who lost the whip last week, has said he's been sent a letter essentially inviting him back into the fold. Do you think the Prime Minister is now deciding, as many of your colleagues urged him to, that people like Mr Gauke are perhaps a better representation of what the Conservative Party is than those on your wing of the party, if you will?
I think you're pushing the point there somehow and extrapolating that. I don't know how you get to that. I was very disappointed that 21 of my colleagues decided to vote against the whip. I voted against the whip myself on numerous occasions, for the referendum, against HS2 every time, against the withdrawal agreement, but I was voting against a specific policy. What they actually did, and they were warned not to do it, was they voted to take away the government's ability to legislate and give it to the opposition. That's a different kettle of fish. They would have to commit not to do that in the future.
Andrew Bridgen, thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie.
Well, one group of people deeply worried about the possibility of a no-deal EU departure are those who rely on medicines. The Operation Yellowhammer report highlighted the danger that medical supplies lines could be disrupted. And this programme has spoken to pharmaceutical companies which have expressed concerns about issues that are beyond their control, such as fuel shortages and delays at ports. Here's our health and social care correspondent, Victoria McDonald.
It is blockages like this at the Port of Dover that are sending a shudder through the collective shoulders of the UK's pharmaceutical companies. This was disruption following a strike in France, but it is precisely this spectre that is being raised if there is a no-deal Brexit. In the Operation Yellowhammer document released by the government last night, they warned that, in a reasonable worst-case scenario, HGVs could face maximum delays of 1.5 to 2.5 days before being able to cross the border. It goes on to say there could be significant disruption lasting up to 6 months. And the document says the reliance of medicines and medical products supply chains on the short straits crossing make them particularly vulnerable to severe extended delays. Pharmaceutical companies have been stockpiling where they can, as asked by the government, and many have between 12 and 14 weeks of supplies. I've spoken to a number of drug companies, and what they're telling me is that they are concerned about those issues that are beyond their control, like blockages at the ports, but also, as is mentioned in Operation Yellowhammer, fuel shortages. So, for instance, if they are stuck for 2 days, but they have to keep the medicines cold, they need to keep that truck running. Where will the fuel come from? And then they say there are concerns over the cost of air freight, which the Department of Health has repeatedly said will be the alternative arrangement for bringing in emergency supplies. The neurologist and whistleblower David Nicol, who contributed to Operation Yellowhammer, listed a number of drugs that could not be stockpiled for a variety of reasons, including sodium valproate used for the control of epilepsy. There had been a temporary disruption in production, which has now been rectified, but it revealed the vulnerability of these supply chains.
Valproate, it's one of the commonly used anti-epileptic drugs. It's and the fact that this was being held under kind of secrecy, that we couldn't talk about these things, and I gather from what you've been told is there were production issues, which meant that they couldn't stockpile sufficiently in March. But fortunately, that factory issue is being dealt with. But obviously, those sort of things can happen all the time in a complex supply chain, as is the case in the pharmaceutical industry. And I certainly felt very, very conflicted that I couldn't even talk about the word valproate because it's some kind of state secret.
The Department of Health and Social Care said they were working closely with industry, including over extra costs, and that their robust plans should help ensure the supply of medicines and medical products remains uninterrupted.
Victoria McDonald there. Well, the NHS Confederation has been arguing for a so-called mini-deal to be struck with the European Union to help the flow of pharmaceuticals and other medical products, even if no overarching agreement has been struck. Earlier, I spoke to the Confederation's International Director, Layla McKay, from Brussels. I started by asking her what she thought when she saw the contents of the Yellowhammer report.
I think that while it still makes you stop and think when you see them written there in black and white, certainly they are the sorts of risks that we've already been anticipating.
I mean, you had been talking about those risks for a very long time, in fact.
Absolutely, and we've been working really closely with the people who are responsible for doing the planning, the Department of Health and Social Care and others, to make sure that these risks are getting addressed. And I think that what we're really keen to think about is, if we have everything in place from a UK perspective, we're still really depending on the EU to ensure that all the plans run smoothly. And that's really a big concern for me.
But you'll know that the government keeps saying they're doing all they can to get a deal. If you're now proposing this sort of mini deal, that suggests you don't trust them.
In order to make sure that both UK and EU patients are not going to suffer as a result of Brexit, it would be really sensible to do a few things in advance to make sure that things will be all right. And people would call it a mini deal. I prefer to think of it more as technical adjustments. The European Commission has already made technical adjustments for fishing and for planes. And if it can do that, then it seems to me that it would only be sensible to do it for something that people care so much about, which is health.
But I suppose the point is, why not leave the government to deal with this? Why, in a sense, are you making this bid today? Because it suggests, as I say, that you either don't trust that the government will deliver, or you are worried about what happens on the 31st of October in terms of risks to patients.
The government has really strong plans of how to protect patients, but as I think we've seen from Yellowhammer and others, it's not just what about our government can deliver. So, for example, one of the aspects I would like to see in terms of a technical adjustment would be that medicines and other medical goods going through the borders are not subject to customs checks for a certain period, and that they're not stuck in these potentially 2-day traffic queues to get across, but they have some kind of expedited route to get in and out of the country.
As things stand at the moment, how confident are you that anyone who needs medicine, anyone who needs treatment after October the 31st will get it?
The plans in place mean it's very likely that anyone who needs treatment in the UK will get it. But it is not 100%, and it can't be, because we don't know all the different things that might happen. I do think that this is a really important issue, the question of health. I mean, it matters to everyone. It's so important. If things go wrong, the ramifications could be huge. And from that perspective, I just think that we need all the precautions that we can possibly take.
Layla McKay, thank you very much for talking to us today.